solve large, intractable problems.
It's a new venture altogether.
Your brain is a wild horse there.
Because remember, writing is not a team sport.
You are not selling horse carriages when there are cars.
I want to be known only as the trusted advisor.
More like a tourist.
Play to Potential podcast.
You know, Jeff and I were, when we were writing the introduction, a few pages, I was charged with writing the last paragraph, something that brings the introduction to a close. And I'll read you our summary statement, which is 2 sentences. Here it is. Our overall takeaway is simple. We are just humbled by the combination of audacity of intent, humility of demeanor, and steadfastness of purpose displayed by the giants whose life lessons are narrated here. And so I would point to the trio of phrases that we use: audacity of intent, humility of demeanor, and steadfastness of purpose. So I think the stories here, in a sense, are each and every one of them is an ode to trust, which was the title of my previous meanderings on development in emerging markets, in their own ways, in their own kind of beautiful ways. But they've all taken a very long time to painstakingly build. It turns out that's what it takes to build something that can redirect a society.
Welcome to the 94th conversation at the Play to Potential podcast, a series of reflective conversations from leading people from various domains on 3 broad themes: leadership, transitions, and careers. Just like businesses need to think about where to play and how to win in the context of their strategy, we all need to think about the 2 questions as we go through our journeys: where to go and how to grow. These questions become that much harder in a world of abundance, multiplicity of options, and limited feedback as you attain greater success. Through this podcast, I hope to share some insights that might help you navigate these questions in a more thoughtful way. While podcasting accounts for 10 to 20% of my time and effort, my primary vocation is that of an executive coach on a discreet sounding board with leaders. I engage with leaders and organizations with a growth mindset. You can learn more about the podcast and my work at playtopotential.com. That's playtopotential.com. My guest this time is Tarun Khanna of Harvard Business School, who was earlier at the podcast about 3.5 years back when he'd authored the book Trust, Creating the Foundation for Entrepreneurship in Developing Economies. This was way back in December 2018, when the world was a very different place. In that conversation, we speak at length about how formal structured markets often haven't evolved for various contracts, and entrepreneurs in these markets, emerging markets, need to build a network of goodwill around them to get things done. Tarun calls it creating the conditions to create. Cutting to today, Tarun has recently co-authored the book Leadership to Last: How Great Leaders Leave Legacies Behind. The book is a culmination of a series of interviews that they've had at Harvard Business School with various leaders in emerging markets. And this includes legends from South Asia such as Ratan Tata, Anu Aga, Adi Godrej, Kiran Mazumdar-Shaw, Devi Shetty, and Rahul Bajaj, just to name a few. If you're a leader trying to build an organization to last, you will find a lot of insights valuable. Without further ado, let's tune into the conversation with Tarun Khanna. Tarun, great to have you back at the Play to Potential podcast. Thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you, Deepak, for having me again.
Before we dive into the book you've just written, Tarun, with Jeffrey, give us a sense of why you wrote this book. Last time we spoke at the podcast, you just published the book on trust. In this context, can you talk a little bit about what's the gap in thinking that this book seeks to address?
Sure, Deepak. This book is really an outgrowth of a much bigger project. The book, as you know, is called Leadership to Last: How Great Leaders Leave Legacies Behind. It's an attempt to bring to the attention of the world an existing video database that Jeff Jones, my co author of this book, and I have been curating with the help of literally dozens of colleagues at Harvard over the last 10 to 15 years, where we are sitting down one on one with amazing people, iconic entrepreneurs from various developing countries. I think we probably have about 20, 25 developing countries, about 150 to 170 people who have sat down with us and given us unfettered access to their memories in some sense. And these are people who don't often speak to the public. So to capture them in first person, usually after they've already had 30 to 50 years building their enterprises. Some of them are for-profit enterprises, some are not-for-profit. And these are all people who, if you tap somebody on the street in that particular country and said, do you know X? Do you know of X? With no exception, right, would they all say, that's an amazing person, or that's an amazing enterprise that's being created. It's really shaped the trajectory of some part of the society of that country. So that's been our criteria for finding these people. Now, these people are not brought to the attention of the world. Even now, I would conjecture that in most countries in the world, if you said, who's a great entrepreneur, they would say Bill Gates or Elon Musk would be the first thing that pop into people's minds. But the world is a big place, and there are people doing amazing creative things all over. And we felt it was almost like a responsibility for Jeff and I, sitting at a leading institution, to contribute to a knowledge stock, so that people who are interested in issues such as this have more to draw upon than simply things they read in the Wall Street Journal or equivalent newspaper in their countries. So the book is a distillation of some of those interviews and an attempt to direct people to the underlying interviews.
And where, for the purpose of the listeners, Tarun, where can they find this video library that you talk about?
So the video library is publicly available. If you just Google Creating Emerging Markets Project at the Harvard Business School, it should pop right up. What you'll see is an interface that lets you tap into search by country, region, industry, setting, gender, all kinds of things. And you can also, that takes you to a place where you could, in principle, download the entire video. I think the requirement there is that you attest that you're using it for some, not for commercial purposes. And you can, and what we've done is we made I think it's about 500 short video clips from these videos. 3 minutes, 4 minutes, maybe at most 5 minutes long, that are searchable by some kind of tag, like, corruption or innovation or ethics or social responsibility, because those are ways people sometimes want to access material. So that's, you can find them all there.
Lovely. And I'll add that to the show notes as I publish this conversation.
Yes, thank you. Yes.
Going back to the companies and the individuals you chose to study, Tarun, in the book at the outset, you say that we are not going after unicorns and people that are creating, if I may use the term, quick wealth, but we're looking for organizations and institutions that have endured. Can you talk a little bit more about how you drew the line for what's legacy, what's long term? What have been some of the filter criteria?
I mean, a very simple operationalization of this is, twofold. One is, these are typically people who have been at the creative helm of their organizations for, I want to say, a minimum of 30 years. More likely, the median is 45 years, maybe sometimes 55 years. So they've really run the marathon. And the reason is that gives time for us to distinguish enduring contribution from episodic. Not Deepak, nothing wrong with episodic contribution. I love the next unicorn as much as you do. I am on the board of several recent unicorns, including some from India. They're built by my students. I aspire to create a unicorn someday. No problem with that. But this is just a different focus. And the other thing is that, as I alluded to a bit earlier, these are organizations that, without exception, if you caught hold of a random person on the streets of that country and said, "Do you know Miss X or Mr. Y?" They would say yes, and there would be a sense of pride in that accomplishment, societal pride in that accomplishment. And I think it's not quite a precise sampling mechanism in some ways, but it's not intended to be. It's intended to get reflections of people we should all learn from at a time that they are predisposed to be candid, which is another aspect that I think is worth highlighting. They are not here to convince you or me that they're amazing. We know that. They're just here to reflect with us. And because they know that it's being made available for the public good, for scholarly purposes, and for teaching and research, and to tell the story of different countries in different ways, they're very candid.
It's a great point. It's not so much about, it's not about their PR and them trying to propagate
no
the
PR.
company's brand. You're right. You're right. And the
I mean,
tonality
one of
is
my favorite
critical.
interviews was with a couple of my favorite interviews one was with R&T, Mr. Tata. He's very candid about all the mistakes, many of the mistakes that he recalls. And it's so refreshing to hear that. And another, who I consider a mentor was a Bangladeshi entrepreneur, Abid Bhai. Sir Fazle Hassan Abid, knighted by the Queen at some point. But really his accomplishment was to build the world's largest nonprofit, which is literally now in 15 to 18 countries. Bill Gates swears by it. It's really, really one of the best run organizations I've known of. It's called BRAC, which is an awkward acronym, which used to be Bangladesh Rehabilitation Action Corp. But BRAC is just BRAC. It's known as BRAC. It's amazing. And but Abid Bhai was, modest to a fault. Sadly, he just passed away. But the modesty and the candor and the reflection is something that you're much less likely to see from someone in their 20s and 30s, right? Just by the nature of human beings.
And as building on that, Tarun, what also struck me was you don't just have industrialists and people that build businesses, but you had someone like a Malika Sarabhai on that list. So I was curious about, it's not somebody I would have thought of in that league of business leaders. I was curious about how you thought about art and institutions and the role they can play in developing society.
Yeah, it's a fair point. I mean, I think the boundaries are a bit blurred, right? One could debate whether, someone like Malika Sarabhai or Shabana Azmi should be in the collection, or some people doing agricultural cooperatives, not for profit in the innermost parts of Africa, Latin America, should be in the broad database. And at the end of the day, I guess that Jeff and I looked for interesting stories and candor and a sense of accomplishment, and as would be clear from the sampling frame, so to speak. Wealth creation is a proxy for achievement, but it is not the only proxy. There are lots of nonprofits in here which have really been amazing. Again, my criteria are shape the trajectories of their own countries in some productive way, generally seen by the lay public as having done so, and willing to sit down with us and reflect in a candid fashion. I think those are the unifying themes across a very diverse set of men and women.
Got it. And cutting across these, Tarun, when we think about leadership, the first generation entrepreneur that builds these
organizations. One
Please,
thing.
Of course.
One really interesting thing, Deepak, is that I think in the 10, maybe 15 years, I forget how long it is since we started, uh, nobody has turned us down. Not one. One instance I can think of was somebody I really wanted to sit down with, someone I really respected, uh, in India, as it turns out, and the family declined because of the person's health, and sadly he passed away. But other than that, we've never been turned down. And it's not like we've gotten everybody either. There are lots of people we should have in the database who are not there, and hopefully, in the fullness of time, we'll get to a much larger sample. But I do think it's important to understand that for whatever reason, the institution that I'm sitting at, Harvard, uh, appears to have the confidence of these leaders to say that we would not abuse the privilege of talking to them and making it available in a to the public in a constructive fashion.
That's interesting you say this. I was talking to another individual on the podcast, and one of the themes he laid out was this is Ravi Venkatesan, actually, who's an alumnus of Harvard himself.
He's my classmate. Yeah.
Is he? Okay, fascinating.
Yes, the same class of '92. Yeah.
Got it. So he spoke about different forms of capital, and one of the things he says is reputational capital. And sometimes when we look at ourselves, we can be a little too narrow and just focus on the financial capital. But this seems like a great example of Harvard using its reputational capital to creating a public good.
Yeah, that's very well said. I think most forms of capital are, as we say, unpriced. They don't have a market price. Physical capital can be priced. Financial capital can be priced. You go out and you raise money for a new venture or a new project, an existing enterprise. There is a cost of money. So money can be priced. Reputation is very hard to price. We try to approximate pricing of reputation and all other forms of intangibles, whether it's social capital or reputational capital, whatever you want to call it. We try to approximate it sometimes in organizations by creating artificial categories like goodwill or something like that on the balance sheet. But these are very rough and crude proxies. Generally speaking, those are assets that are hard to imitate, take a long time to build, and are easy to squander.
Got it. Moving to leadership, Tarun. Last time we spoke, you'd spoken about creating the conditions to create when it applies to entrepreneurs in emerging markets. When you look at this study where you've spoken to entrepreneurs across several markets, and when you look at them and their leadership, are there a few things that stand out with these people when you sort of compare them to some of the leaders in the West? Any headline unique elements that stand out for you?
So I'm opening my book to read a phrase so I don't
Absolutely
misquote it. Jeff and I were, when we were writing the introduction, a few pages, I was charged with writing the last paragraph, something that brings the introduction to a close. And I'll read you our summary statement, which is 2 sentences. Here it is. Our overall takeaway is simple. We are just humbled by the combination of audacity of intent, humility of demeanor, and steadfastness of purpose displayed by the giants whose life lessons are narrated here. And so I would point to the trio of phrases that we use: audacity of intent, humility of demeanor, and steadfastness of purpose. So I think the stories here, in a sense, are each and every one of them is an ode to trust, which was the title of my previous meanderings on development in emerging markets, in their own ways, in their own kind of beautiful ways. But they've all taken a very long time to painstakingly build. It turns out that's what it takes to build something that can redirect a society. Um, there's a lot of humility in these people. Maybe to some extent that's what it takes to build coalitions around you who participate with you to co-create as I said in my earlier book, to create the conditions to create with you, so that you can collectively be much greater than individual efforts would allow. But they're not shy about what they want to accomplish, and they have big goals. They want to emancipate women, or they want to, cure the world. They're not shy of ambition, but they're very cognizant of their human limitations and willing to say sorry and reflect on their life trajectory. And they're willing to take the slow and steady, long road, which is why the book is called Leadership to Last, with an emphasis. If you look at the cover of the book, the last is the biggest word.
Interesting. I didn't notice that. Okay. I didn't pick that up.
There's lots of books on leadership. One of the first things Jeff and I asked ourselves was, why in heaven's name are we writing another book on leadership? We go to the airport, there's like 50 books on leadership. And I think the answer to us was, at the end of the day, those three phrases that I articulated, and the fact that we were looking over the longue durée, the very long horizon, and this word lasting leadership.
This is your host Deepak Jayaraman here. What's interesting is the number of times humility shows up as a leadership trait that's relevant in different contexts, whether it's leadership to last or leadership to create psychological safety to navigate an uncertain world. Amy Edmondson, also a professor at Harvard Business School, and recently rated as the #1 management thinker in the world by Thinkers 50 for her work on psychological safety, spoke about 3 traits that she looks for in leaders, and humility shows up here once again, not surprisingly. Research.
I'm going to say 3. 2 of them I've already mentioned. But then we might have to talk a little bit about how do you measure these, because you probably know more about this than I do, from a search perspective. But the 3 I'm going to say are humility, curiosity, and empathy. Now notice I didn't say brilliance. I didn't say, extensive industry experience and all of the rest, because I think, first of all, often there's certain kinds of experience that are just table stakes, right? You're not going to be considered for a job if you have no background that's relevant, and so I'm assuming you've got those. But then, humility is that Alan Mullally sense of, I don't have all the answers, and I'm confident that if we pull the best minds together with a good process around the table, we will come up with the answers we need, right? So that's humility. It's a confidence in what we can do rather than what I know.
Back to what Tarun says, audacity of intent and humility of demeanor can feel like opposing forces, but I guess great leaders manage to walk that tightrope effectively. Let's now get back to the conversation with Tarun Khanna. And if we could stay with that, Tarun, you said, right, you looked at people who've run the marathon, proverbial marathon. What have you seen about how they've sort of managed to stay energized around the cause over the long term? Anything that you notice them do to replenish themselves or refresh that why? Any empirical observations there?
I mean, the only thing that comes to mind, Deepak, is that there's a inevitable sense of sort of a deep commitment to partnerships of all sorts, and partnerships in the sense that I spoke about in my earlier work on trust, where you build out the ecosystem collectively with others because you're compensating for institutional weaknesses that are endemic in developing countries. That's one kind of partnership. So, in the book, we have a variety of stories from Rosario Bozan in Colombia, this amazing agribusiness entrepreneur, Jaime Ayala in Manila, Patrick Shaloub in the Middle East, James Mwangi in Kenya, and a whole host in India that would be more familiar to your listeners, Nanda and Kiran Devi, just to take three Bangaloreans, and they're all collectively creating ecosystems. They're building the institutions as they go along, right? And those institutions, of course, are helping build their individual enterprises, but they're also leaving residues of institutions behind so that others can free ride on those efforts. And that's what it takes. So they're not small-minded to say, oh, I'm not going to build this because most of the benefits will accrue to society. They just do it because there really isn't an alternative. The alternative is to wait for the state, and the state takes a while to get around to these things, given the reality of political economies in these countries. So there is that sense of partnership, but there's also, the book starts with a chapter on families. And it just turns out that, by the way, this is true in the US also, but more so in developing countries, I think, that almost all these enterprises have a deep sense of family as a stabilizing mechanism behind the entrepreneur. So I often say in my own entrepreneurial journeys, or when I'm working with my students or counseling them one way or another, I always ask them, do you have a safety net if you're going to be an entrepreneur? Because it's a rough and tumble kind of existence, and it's a lonely business, actually. But when I say safety net, I mean two things. The easier safety net is the financial safety net. If you have a good idea, capital will often find a way to you. But also a psychological safety net. Maybe a spouse, maybe an extended family, maybe a network of friends, something like that. And you find that in the chapter on families. We start the book with that because families to us just loom large in not all the stories, but in most of the stories. There's a subtext that the family is, not that the family is only positives. Anyone who's in a large family knows that there are lots of negatives in any family. But people have learned to manage the downsides while accentuating the positives. Rahul Bhai just passed away, unfortunately, Rahul Bajaj, and he had a nice quote in there on this, just saying that, the brothers in a family are like the fingers on a hand. They're not all the same size, have the same capabilities. So you have to be do the right thing for the right person. So I would say the ethos of partnerships, in a very Big Ten sense, all the way from partnering with family members or networks of friends, to partnering with the more conventional business partners, to partnering with the state, to collectively co-create something.
This is your host Deepak Jayaraman here. Tarun speaks about each finger of the hand being different. There are some situations where the family pulls along, but I feel that it's also critical to call out the quality of conflict management, which can often pave the way for extraordinary value creation. Earlier in the podcast, Harsh Mariwala of Marico speaks about how he went through a separation of business, but strived to keep the relationships intact during the separation and subsequently as well.
It so happened that there were some issues which led to a lack of trust amongst the family, and I think that forced us to separate. So it was not something which was planned. It happened because of certain circumstances, which was, I never thought it would happen. But when that happened, I thought it better to separate, because if there is no trust, then you can't exist as partners. So that event, those set of events which happened after Marico was formed, immediately after it was formed, the first 2-3 years, led to this situation where we also separated financially. Any family financial separation is painful. It's because there is some degree of bad blood at that particular point of time. So you have a relationship which is very good at a social level, but that phase because its financials are involved, there tends to be some degree of bad blood. And then there is your degree of uncertainty. What will happen? Will it conclude properly? Will it not conclude? So impact of that on business is another thing. So that could lead to high degree of stress. Number 3 is you are managing a business as well as you are doing these negotiations which are time consuming. So there is that degree of stress. So I would say a combination of uncertainty, stress and temporary bad relationships is something you need to go through, and there is no other alternative. I think one has to go through, but looking back, I mean, those 2-3 years were painful, were stressful, were taxing, but I think it has paved the way of the relationships are almost back to normal in terms of socially and things like that. And I think somebody has to take an initiative in terms of within the family. And normally initiatives start around some events, either sad events or happy events, like a marriage or you lost somebody in the family, and that is the time when the family tends to unite. Because these are very important events, either very sad events like a demise or a happy event like a marriage. And that is the time when, you start thinking, okay, now we have to start feeling united. And over a period of time, I think it goes on, at least in our case, it improves. In some cases, some families, but I think it takes 2 to clap. So both parties have to forget the past, let it be bygones, rather than holding on to some event which was a cause of stress at a certain point of time. And look at future, and you may not be the best of friends, but the relationship is almost back on track.
Going back to what Tarun says earlier in the conversation, I guess this is where some of the humility of demeanor begins to matter in meaningfully resolving these sticky situations. For more, tune into the conversation with Harsh Mariwala. If you're enjoying this conversation, you might also find some of the conversations of the podcast of interest. Apart from the one with Harsh that I referenced here, you might also enjoy the conversations with Nandan Nilekani, Meher Padamji, and Harish Bhatt of Tata Group of specific interest. You can find them in the guest section at playtopotential.com. If you have a moment, do take the time and rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It will really help the listeners discover this content from several other options that are available for them. This also gives comfort to speakers that this is worth their investment in time. Now let's get back to the conversation with Tarun. And staying with families, Tarun, when you think about how the baton gets passed from one generation to another, when you look at entrepreneurs that have built successful businesses, what have you seen as some of the practices and the way they deal with the next gen in terms of giving them, autonomy to pursue what they want, at the same time, thinking about sort of the custodianship of a business, if such a term exists, and setting them up for success. So can you talk a little bit about that transition from one generation to another?
There are a few things that jump to mind. It's not obviously a comprehensive answer, but some observations. Well-run families often have a period of apprenticeship for the next generation, where the next generation, first of all, there has to be some kind of filtering process to decide whether someone is interested in joining. And if he or she is interested in joining, then do they have the competence to do it? And if so, how can it be nurtured to see how far they can go? Lots of families talk about this. Bajaj interviews talk about this. I think, if I remember correctly, Adi Godrej's interview talks about this. The Murugappas in the South talk about this, and so on. The Ayala family definitely talks about it. Various businesses in West and East Africa, you see it. So this is a theme that comes up all the time, is that how do you decide whether X person in the next generation has the interest and the competence to do this? And if not, can we find a different way to help them fulfill their aspirations, whatever they might be? I'm reminded of a close friend who I leave unnamed because yeah, they're in the book. They're a Middle Eastern family in the book, and the oldest brother in the current generation said to me that, for goodness sake, it's one of the biggest businesses in this part of the world, but I have zero interest. I want to be a painter. I want to live in Europe. And, to their credit, the family orchestrated it so that he's a painter in Europe. Not a very good one of that, but so be it. So
It's a choice.
he has aspirations. And a much younger person took over the main business. So I think those are hallmarks of good
And if
stewardship.
I stay with that, Tarun, in terms of navigating that conversation of skill and will, interest and competence, do you see these families work with somebody to get to a meaningful place, or is it sort of an internal discussion? Is there an insight into how they how this unfolds?
Deepak, on that, I couldn't really be sure. I can say from my own personal experiences with maybe half a dozen families in India that I've had the pleasure and privilege of knowing for at least 20 to 30 years, that they've all struggled. Some have struggled with candor and good humor, and some have struggled mightily and unpleasantly. So it's a little hard for me, a bit disingenuous for me to draw generalizations. There's a whole industry of advisors who specialize in family transitions, and I'm sure they can be quite useful. But certainly having someone who is singled out as the most respected in the previous generation is almost, I venture to say, is a necessary condition for transitioning, because there has to be someone who's orchestrating and people respect. And even the transitions that I can think of in Indonesia, Kenya, South Africa, India, Pakistan that are going on right now that I personally know, all have this characteristic that there is a person who everybody respects. He or she is driving it. And there are usually one or two trusted counselors on the outside who are just lending a ear and trying to give an impartial opinion. But it's a tricky process. How many of us have seen? I've seen this in the academic community, to take a different context, right? Someone has been a very successful academic in an institution like mine, which is quite visible, and they don't want to let go, right? Because that's what they do. And what else would I do when I wake up tomorrow morning? So you convince yourself that it's in everybody's interest that you stick around, even probably usually long after it is in everybody's interest that you stick around. So I've told my wife that if I get to that point, she should drag me out, take me home. So
Got it. I think on that note, you refer to the Murugappa group in the book, and you speak about the notion of someone called a karta. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. It's somebody, not necessarily the elderly, but somebody who's formally appointed as as a person who could sort of solve some of these tricky situations like that. Have you seen any? Could you sort of expand on that, or can you think of other parallels where companies formally think about solving?
There's a very prominent North Indian industrial family, where there are multiple brothers in the current generation, one of whom is a spectacular operator and would be CEO, and the other is a spectacular ambassador at large. And each would be terrible at the other's job. And so one could imagine that there's a very nice division of responsibilities, where someone is like, in India, you would say the foreign minister, and someone is the prime minister, so to speak, or in the US, you'd say secretary of state and the president, right? They divide up the responsibilities. though I have to say that that's a bit rarer than I would like it to be. Um, um, so the Murugappas make it sound like that is a pretty traditional practice in their community and at that time, and I'm sure it is. But the situation that I just described with this North Indian family, I wish it were more common. Usually, you have somebody who rises to the top and takes charge, and he or she thinks they can do it all, and of course, nobody can. So it could be better. Let's just put it that way in most cases. But Deepak, we're all human beings, so we all have plenty of rough edges. I certainly do. So.
All of us do. Um, Going back to the point you made about apprenticeship, Tarun, uh, when we look at some of these businesses, as you reflect on how they get the next gen, you know, uh, how they think about apprenticeship for the next gen, once again, any structural themes that stand out for you in terms of what enduring families have done in getting the next gen the right kind of exposure and immersion in the business?
Um, so I'm reminded of Sanjay Lalbhai's interview of Arvind Mills. It's a very old business family, very, very storied, great history, great tradition, very philanthropic. I did not do the interview, but I remember my colleague who did. And what struck me from that interview was the extent to which the previous generation from Sanjay's, I forget the gentleman's name, went out of his way to make sure that every man and woman in the next generation was given a chance to actualize their own potential. And that requires some process of self discovery. Um, you know, and I suppose if you're fortunate enough to be from a well-off family, then you have resources to engage in the process of self-discovery, which is not a luxury available to the vast majority of people in poor countries. Um, that's the thing that stands out, is this process of self-discovery for the next generation without ex ante judgment that not being in the business is a failure, which is often a sad thing that you know people say, I wish my son or daughter would be X, and what a great sorry, I think in Hindi, itna bada karobar banaya hai, it's this huge enterprise. And so it's a tragedy that so and so, my next generation, doesn't want to run it. But that's missing. It's more like, what do you want to do? And how can we be productive? And the thinking, I think, is very much that even if you're not participating, you can still participate in a governance sense, right? You can still be on the board. You can still have some stewardship. You can still be the custodian of values. And I think that's a very important thing for families to do. I'm just reminded of the interview that one of my colleagues did with Sanjay Lalbhai. I was not present when the interview was done, but I loved the interview because one of the things that Sanjay emphasized was how his predecessor, the head of the family before him, really went out of his way to make sure that every man and woman in the next generation had an opportunity to, what I would call, engage in a process of self-discovery of interest, because and there wasn't really either the implicit or the explicit assumption that the quote unquote right or respectable thing to do would be to take one's titular role as head of the enterprise. And it was some kind of a, maybe like a soft competition to see who it made sense to run. The ethos seemed to be, as I read between the lines, and if Sanjay hears this, he may want to correct me. When I read between the lines, it's more what we like to see in so-called liberal arts universities in the United States, with which I'm familiar, which is whatever it is that you do, engage in it with passion and with dedication and with depth, and find out if you like it. And if you don't like it, then the world's a big place, and there's lots of areas of intellectual endeavor, and you can find something else. So I think it's this giving free rein. Now, of course, this is a luxury. Not everybody, particularly in a poor country, has the luxury to go on a voyage of self-discovery for years on end. But I suppose if you have it, you might as well use it. And that allows people to find the right person to take on the family mantle, so to speak. One thing I would say about families is that they really are it's kind of an obvious point, but they really are the custodians of the values. When I think about my good friend Jaime Ayala, who is, I think, the sixth or seventh generation of the Ayala family in the Philippines, in Manila, and whose family has been credited with essentially building a large parts of modern Manila. Um, I think of them very much as the Tatas of the Philippines, so to speak, for want of a better, rough, approximate comparator. But Jaime's conversations are all about stewardship. They're not about unicorns. They're about stewardship and doing the right thing for the society in which they're embedded. Of course, the Ayalas are very successful business people and want to be commercially successful, and those are not at odds. That commercial success, I think, can go hand in hand with societal progress, broad-based societal progress.
I'd love to come to this point about, how institutions think about preserving values. But going back to the self-discovery point, Tarun, I just wanted to stay with that for a minute or two to really say, what do they, if you could break down a little more tactically, what some of these organizations do with the next gen to help them with self-discovery. Could you give us a little more granular sense of the kinds of things they do to drive that?
I'm trying to think, if I would be so bold as to attempt a taxonomic answer. I'm not sure I really can, but let me give it a shot. I think it seems to start from a pretty early age, when people are encouraged to think about what motivates them. By early age, I would say, well before someone enters into college, and when people start getting exposed. Of course, these families have the luxury that their next generations can be exposed to a variety of stimuli. If you were not exposed to a variety of stimuli, it's hard to know what you like and what you don't like. So that's certainly a benefit. They tend to have had experiences outside of the family business, so as to be exposed to a different way of doing things. It's almost, in modern terminology, we might say the family's crowdsourcing insight for the next generation. I'm reminded of a friend of mine who's Andronico Luxic, who is someone who should be in the book, but I don't think is. Chilean mining and construction businessman. And I remember a conversation with him in New York some 10 years ago when he said, I'm sending one of my children to Beijing and one of my children to Bangalore, because I think that both these economies are going to be large economies. I'm from Chile. Chile is a small economy, and I think it's good for them and for me and Ronico Luxic and for the Luxic family, for the next generation to have a variety of exposures. So it's interesting that it is, and he did that. He had an apartment in Beijing for many years.
Sounds like a geopolitical strategy for the family.
Well, but it's not that unusual. I mean, if you look even in ancient Indian families, they would have one person in the army, one person in the government services, one in private. So it's not that uncommon for the steward of the family to be thinking about who's the right person to take his or her role, usually his, in most of these traditional society, but also be thinking, how do you diversify the asset exposures of the family as in toto. And that's just one small example of it, but you see it all over. The other thing that you see is the sort of patriarch or the matriarch of the family is trying to part of this self-discovery process is also to create mutually separated spheres of influence for the next generations, right? So somebody might say, okay, you're in manufacturing, the other person is in financial services, the other one's in life sciences, the other one's in something, which is another very common thing that you that you see. I've seen that so often, of course, in India also, and in Korea and in Indonesia and Africa again. So these seem like they're universal patterns.
This is your host Deepak Jayaraman here. I like the phrase Tarun uses. Each person is given an opportunity to actualize their potential and go on a process of self-discovery. Something similar came up in my conversation with Meher Padamji, chairperson of Thermax.
I've always believed, and Firoz and I both have partnered each other in believing that our children really should decide what they want to do in terms of what they're genuinely interested in, what they're passionate about, what makes them happy. I don't ever want my children to feel that Thermax is a burden and that they have to take over or any such thing. I feel they need to be responsible owners. They need not be in day-to-day management. If they want to do something else with their life, it's entirely up to them. I don't think it's fair for me to prescribe or for Firoz to prescribe in terms of you shall do engineering so that then you can come and you can join the company and then you can work up the ranks and no. Luckily for us, our son is interested in joining the organization. At the same time, I've shared with him in terms of that I have a regret of not joining somebody else before joining Thermax. So if you feel that that's the right thing to do, I think you might be happy to get inputs elsewhere before you come and join the company. So he's in that stage of thinking it through. He started off with engineering and then moved to economics. Thinking in between that, if I give up engineering, my parents will be really unhappy. And we've honestly stuck to our belief of saying, really do what you enjoy doing. And I would say that my parents said the same thing to Kurush and me. They never ever made us feel that you have to join Thermax. Having said that, of course, subtle pressures are always there. And of course, people came in as we were growing up. People would come in from Thermax, come home and sit with my parents, chat, and we would be hovering around. So you're constantly hearing. I would go to the factory at some stage on a Saturday.
While Meher speaks about this in the context of family business, I guess enabling the kids to go through the process of self-discovery to actualize the potential has gotten to become part of the job description of every parent these days. A lot of people say that the world of careers used to be an 8-lane highway earlier, but now it feels more like a maze. To stretch that metaphor further, if we were an automobile, the steering wheel has become a lot more important than the engine to navigate the maze. And that steering wheel, I believe, is self-awareness. Now let's get back to the conversation with Tarun. Moving to how some of these organizations empower professional CEOs, Tarun, one of the themes I was reflecting on was, at some level, these entrepreneurs are playing the long game, the infinite game, if you will, and professionals often come in, and the duration of, I wonder if principal agency problem is the right way to frame this, but they often solve for a different duration. So, any observations you have about how entrepreneurs strike that balance of solving for the long term while getting short term leadership?
First of all, I would say that generally they don't do it well. Even these iconic entrepreneurs, my general observation is that it's pretty hard to do. And it's understandable because a hotshot professional who's not part of a family kind of have this feeling that his or her upside is capped, and maybe to some extent you can compensate by monetary upside, if not titular upside or ability to move up the hierarchy. So that is an issue. It's a general issue. And so when you think about how the vast majority of these organizations that are profiled here, particularly the for-profits, not the not-for-profits, but particularly the for-profits, are family-run enterprises or family-controlled enterprises. That's a downside of family ownership, right? That it's not unfettered access to the markets for talent, because a lot of talented people would not want to work in there since they know ex ante that their upside is capped. And so that has to be counterbalanced with the pros of the family enterprise, which is continuity, playing the long game, transmission of values, what have you. And it's an empirical question which side dominates. The pros dominate the cons. But I think the way you said it is correct. There is a principal agent problem. The family is the principal and the agent is the professional. And like in any principal agent problem, there are incentive issues that have to be dealt with in the neoclassical model of economics. You would deal with it with contracts. So you would have a formal, employment contract with compensation clauses and so on. That process of creating contracts to manage the principal agent problem is perhaps most refined in the United States of all economies. And I sit on a number of boards in the U.S. and including sometimes on the compensation committee, and you spend a lot of time designing these contracts. I'm just mentioning this because none of that exists in most of these developing countries. In most of the developing countries, the contract is more of an implicit one. Of course, there's an agreement on salary and bonus, but that's pretty simple. That's a simple contract. For the most part, it's trust between the head of the company, typically a family member, or the board, and the hired professional. And of course, a contract like that only lasts as long as it's mutually beneficial. But you find that the implicit contract that is implied by the values are a far more effective way to retain good managers and good professionals than any attempt to micromanage compensation details. In the US, you see a lot of micromanagement of compensation details. There's an endless amount of time spent. There are compensation consultants, there's surveys. People are making sure that the board is at the 60th percentile for this size and this industry, and the CEO is not above the 75th and not below the 45th. And it's just nuts.
Actually, moving to an adjacent theme, Tarun, we'd interacted when I was at Egon Zehnder with a South Indian-based, you were on the board of a South Indian-based company, and we were looking for a leader. I was curious if you found any patterns in the kind of people, the kind of professionals that flourish in a business family. Are there one or two strands that stand out for you for the professional?
In India, I would say until recently, until maybe 10 years ago, to pick a number, I would say there was something that distinguished it. The people who worked in family-run enterprises tended to be more willing to play a comparable long game, at least over the arc of their careers. And that somehow seemed more suited to family-run enterprises, which had this long time horizon attribute to them. But lately, I would say I can't see any pattern, because now even the family enterprises are getting more and more dynamic and modern and competing for the same talent pool with standalone de novo ventures, if you will, not those that have been inherited from a previous generation. So it's hard to say, Deepak. I don't know what distinguishes them. I would say it's not really the family dimension per se, other than the fact that we talked about earlier, which is that the family enterprise has a natural cap on how far you can go, just by definition.
This is your host Deepak Jayaraman here. The point Tarun makes about the principal agency problem is true not just in the way entrepreneurs pick CEOs, but I find that it's also true in the way they engage with various advisors. To the extent they can take a journey view and enroll a few advisors who can walk the long game with them, I feel the better aligned the incentives are and better mutual value that's created in these situations. I'm reminded of a conversation with Sukhinder Singh Cassidy, who was the head of Google in Asia Pacific in the past and has also written the book Choose Possibility. She speaks about the benefits of working with a coach for over a decade.
If you give up on having a coach, let's say at year 2, they haven't seen your cycles to reflect back to you. Number 2, he has been a constant who's been with me through multiple management teams. He's somebody I can bring in who both has my history, but can help new people get to know me and navigate me, help me navigate them. So I've actually used him even as somebody to get my 360 feedback from, because my management teams know that I trust him. They know that so they know that maybe if they want to give me feedback and they're too afraid to give it to me, face to face, which sometimes leadership teams are. It doesn't matter how much you ask for it. They know that I'm providing them a conduit for somebody I trust who can hold their feedback and give it to me. So that history has a lot of value, right? It helps with pattern recognition. So I'd say one of the biggest values has been it's one of my longest standing relationships beside my marriage. And it's somebody who can reflect back to me what I said 5 years ago, what can stitch together my own feelings of myself with when I use him to get peer feedback or 360 feedback, he can stitch together other people's views of me and help give me a holistic perspective. And I know, and I think at the end of the day, this is the value of coaches. We know that, yes, we may be paying them, but their job is to help us be our best selves with no skin in the game other than our success, no politics other than, it's just a very pure relationship. And so I appreciate that. I appreciate having somebody in my corner with whom I can be completely authentic, who has no other vested interest other than my success. And who I also trust to give me feedback, right? I trust they have my goodest, best intentions. So I think it's a conduit for us as leaders. I think that a great coach is a conduit for us to learn about ourselves, probe ourselves, challenge ourselves. And that's why I like the history and tenure in that relationship. That has given me disproportionate value.
Personally speaking, as a practicing coach, if I've engaged with a leader for a while, that cumulative context is immensely valuable in my ability to be of value to that leader and the organization. If you're building a business to last, I guess the mindset with which you engage with agents is crucial, whether it's a CEO, a management consultant, a banker, lawyer, or an executive coach. Now let's get back to the conversation with Tarun. The other theme you speak about in the book, Tarun, is compassionate capitalism, right? With a lot of these businesses where there's the social impact angle. And once again, in the context of a professional transition, I was curious about how some of these institutions ensure that the tightrope of compassion and capitalism, sort of the trade-offs are made with a similar lens. Any observations there to how companies manage that tightrope?
That's a phrase that we are hearing a lot more now, but more broad-based capitalism, more stakeholder rather than shareholder capitalism, or compassionate capitalism. I mean, there's overlap across these themes, and in a sense, it's also overlaps with the earlier characterization that I offered in this conversation, but also in some of my previous writings, which is that successful enterprises in the long haul tend to not shy away from the creation of general public goods. And the reason it's the same thing, I'll illustrate with an interview that I did of Suresh Krishna, the TVS Group. And, I think that family has been pretty instrumental in taking care of worker safety type issues. And in addition to sort of preserving the cultural fabric of some parts of Tamil Nadu in particular, especially around Madurai, they've also been pretty far-sighted about employment practices and so on. And, I don't think that's been costly to them in the long run. In the short run, yes, you can say that, why are you spending so much more money? And I know that when I've sat on the board of some of those companies, I've sometimes complained and said, we can't be the Mai Baap Sarkar of everybody, the Annadata of every employee here. That's not our purpose. But the reality is that at some basic level, they're right, I think, that what they're doing is setting a tone, being an example for taking care of a societal actor who is not otherwise taken care of by society, because the state has not matured enough to be able to provide those smoothing out mechanisms that are needed in the rough and tumble of life. So I think the creation of the public goods often leans in the direction of what you're referring to as compassion in compassionate capitalism.
Got it. And moving forward, you also talk in the book about the choice that some of these companies make around the pace of growth. And you say that if you want to grow with a certain sense of culture and values, you can't grow too fast. How do you observe this play out in how organizations deliberately moderate the pace of growth while ensuring that they're building a unit with stable values and principles?
I think the simplest way to think of this is that at any moment, if you're a reasonably successful enterprise, you're confronted with many more opportunities than you have resources to pursue them, almost definitionally. And then the question is, what filtering criteria are you using to sort these out? If it's a purely commercial criterion, chances are you will grow your top line and bottom line fast. But if it's a combination of a commercial criterion and some other, let's call it constraint, self-imposed constraint, let's call it values, zero corruption or values or something like that, it's, axiomatic almost that you will not grow as fast as somebody who's unconstrained. But another way to say it, sometimes business people resist when I say that. They say, no, we can grow as fast. But I sometimes say it the following way, which they find more palatable, right? Which is, think of it as a short-run investment for longer-run growth in some ways. So you're leaving money on the table to earn the license to exist in the long run. It's no different than an investment in a physical asset. It's an investment in an intangible asset that turns out to pay out handsomely.
This is your host Deepak Jayaraman here. I think there are two dimensions to think about here. One is tangible versus intangible. The other is flow metrics versus asset metrics. I guess a lot of us are wired to think of and solve for tangible flow metrics. If we want to play the long game, I guess it makes immense sense to start focusing on the intangible asset metrics as well. Linda Grattan of London Business School speaks about the notion of intangible assets in a personal context that we all could think of, especially during midlife.
We talked about 3 types of intangible assets. We talked about productive assets, vitality assets, and transformational assets. And I think really, in your 40s, the productive assets become really important because you need to keep on learning. You need to keep on building new skills. You need to be saying to yourself and to the labour market, I'm still somebody who's got a lot to offer from now until the age of 70. So that's really crucial. But also, of course, transformational assets. And those are, as we said earlier, transformational assets are a lot to do with your network. So if at 40 you find yourself spending all your time with people just like you, then that's not going to help you to transform. So you should be looking around and asking yourself, am I spending time with people who are different from me in terms of their nationality or their mindset or their age or their gender?
The paradox is that the external world may not reward you for this in the short term, but as Tarun says, it might help you earn the license to exist and thrive in the long run. And that's business case enough. Now let's get back to the conversation with Tarun. Tarun, I think this sort of brings us to the end of the conversation. Once again, this podcast is titled Play to Potential. And when we think about some of these institutions that have been built and some of these entrepreneurs that have built some of these enduring institutions, any headline themes you want to leave the listeners with in terms of playing to potential over the long term in building institutions that endure?
Yeah, so I would say the world's potential. Let me restart. As we are recording this podcast, Deepak, Mr. Putin is wreaking havoc in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine. It's a surreal situation and still has the potential to spiral out of control. So it's very sobering. And that's perhaps an egregious example of how many people today, so there are roughly 8 billion people in the world today. I would say that 7 billion of those 8 billion are kind of locked out of the mainstream of societies. So when you take the title of your podcast, Play to Potential, the world's potential is completely untapped. We have organized, we as a species have organized so that 7/8 of our potential is rendered impotent currently. So I think the upside is very, very high if we think of what can be done. And the people who can show us how to do it are the ones that are profiled, not just in this book, but the much broader selection in the Creating Emerging Markets project, which is a live project. So as we speak, we're adding dozens and dozens more interviews from dozens of countries. These are people who can at least show us how they contributed to a more inclusive way of living. That hopefully allows us to bring some of these 7 billion excluded people into the mainstreams of society. So that's the idealist in me, the sappy, naive.
But it's a wonderful way of framing it. I think there's a huge social impact and an inclusion element to the way these businesses have been built and continue to be built.
I'm almost comfortable saying that it's a defining criterion of longevity of reputation and long-lived success, is that most of the benefits of your action don't accrue to you. You may still be a billionaire or gazillionaire, but the fact is that those who are in that category have probably contributed tens or hundreds of billions of whatever the currency is worth of goodness to their societies. So that seems like almost a defining criteria.
Lovely. On that note, Tarun, thank you so much for making the time on the podcast.
Deepak, very grateful, especially at this awkward hour for you.
Not at all. Hope you found the conversation of value. If this topic is of interest, you might like the conversations with Nandan Nilekani, Meher Padamji, Harsh Mariwala and Harish Bhatt of the Tata Group relevant. You might also like the curated playlist on entrepreneurship, where we feature some of the wisdom around what it takes to build high-quality companies that last and make a difference to the society. Just one last request before you sign off. Do take a moment to rate and review the show on Apple or Spotify or wherever else you consume the content. Thank you, and look forward to having you at one of the subsequent conversations of the podcast. Bye now.